The forest was quiet that night, quiet enough that Evan could hear the soft creak of his cabin walls and the steady drip of rain sliding off the roof. He had lived there for almost 5 years, far away from towns, noise, and people. The woods were his peace. The only company he usually had was the sound of wind and the call of distant owls. But that night something felt different. The quiet did not feel calm. It felt tense, like the air was waiting for something to happen. He sat near the fire with a book in his hands, though he was not really reading. His dog had been gone for weeks, lost to the forest, and since then, every small sound made him alert. He told himself the noise outside was probably a deer or the wind moving a loose shutter. But when he heard a faint sound again, a tiny cry, soft and trembling, he froze. It was not a sound the forest made. It was not a sound an animal made. It sounded like someone trying not to be heard. He stood up slowly and reached for the old lantern hanging near the door. The rain outside had grown heavier, drumming against the roof like steady fingers. He wrapped his coat around his shoulders and stepped out into the night. Cold wind hit his face. The air smelled of wet wood and earth. He walked toward the sound, the lantern's light shaking with every step. At first he saw nothing. Then just behind the cabin near the pile of chopped wood, he noticed something strange. The ground was muddy from the rain, but a trail of footprints glowed faintly in the light. They were small and light, and they shimmered with a pale blue glow as if dust from the stars had fallen there. Evan knelt and touched one. The glow clung to his fingers like powder, then faded. He had never seen anything like it. The prints led toward his shed, the small wooden structure where he kept tools and supplies. The door was slightly open, creaking softly as the wind moved it. He could hear breathing from inside, quick and shallow. His pulse began to race, but curiosity pushed him forward. He called out in a calm voice, saying that whoever was there could come out, that he meant no harm. There was no reply, only silence and the steady sound of rain. He moved closer and pushed the door open. The lantern light fell across the dark corners of the shed. Something shifted in the far corner, a shadow, small and trembling. Then he saw eyes. They reflected the lantern light like polished silver. They blinked once, twice, and then a small figure tried to hide behind a wooden crate. Evan took a careful step forward. The figure made a frightened sound like a whisper and a sob mixed together. He stopped moving. His voice softened. He said it was all right, that he would not hurt her. The lantern light caught a glimpse of her face. It was a girl, or something close to one. Her hair was pale like silver thread, wet and tangled against her cheeks. Her skin had a faint glow, almost transparent, and her ears were long and delicate. Shaped like a fox's, she looked weak, cold, and completely lost. She tried to speak, but the words came out in a strange rhythm, like music in a language he did not know. Her voice trembled and tears rolled down her cheeks, shining in the dim light. She wore a torn gray cloth wrapped around her shoulders and held something small and metallic in her hands, clutching it as if it was her only safety. Evan lowered the lantern slowly and raised his hands to show he carried no weapon. He said softly that she should not be afraid. The girl's breathing eased a little, but she still watched him carefully, her wide eyes full of fear. Then he noticed her ankle. It was bleeding and strange dust shimmered from the wound. It looked more like light than blood. He took off his scarf and moved a step closer, kneeling down. She flinched but did not run. He gently placed the scarf on the ground near her, not touching her, letting her decide. She looked at the fabric for a long moment, then slowly reached out and pulled it closer to herself. She wrapped it around her ankle, trembling all the while. Evan backed away and left the lantern inside for her. He told her she could stay, that he would be inside the cabin if she needed warmth or food. The girl did not reply, but her eyes followed him until he stepped out into the rain again. When he reached his cabin, he turned back once. Through the half-open door of the shed, the lantern light glowed softly. He could see her shape sitting there, small and still. For a long time he stood by the window, listening to the rain and wondering what kind of being was hiding behind his home. He felt a strange mix of fear and protectiveness. Whatever she was, she had looked more lost than dangerous. As the storm grew stronger, thunder echoed through the valley. He sat by the fire again. She must have gone to the stream at dawn. The broken scarf was tied around her ankle, and the wound looked a little better. She held the small metallic object in her hands again, turning it over and over like it was something precious. It looked like a broken pendant, half of a circle with tiny lines carved into its surface. glowing faintly when light touched it. Evan said good morning softly. The girl looked up, startled, and pulled the pendant close to her chest. For a moment she looked like she might run, but then she saw the calm in his face and stayed still. He offered her a piece of bread and some warm soup he had brought. She stared at the bowl for a long moment before slowly taking it. Her fingers were long and slim, with faint markings that looked like faint veins of light beneath her skin. She smelled the soup first, as if unsure what it was, then tasted it carefully. Evan sat a few feet away, giving her space. He tried to speak gently, asking where she came from, but she only tilted her head, not understanding. She spoke a few words in her strange voice, each sound soft and musical. He could not make sense of them. Still, her tone carried meaning, fear, confusion, and maybe hope. She pointed at herself, then at the sky. He understood enough to guess. She was not from here. After a few moments, she noticed the old radio sitting on a shelf in the shed. She stood limping a little and went to it. Her fingers touched the metal carefully, almost with reverence. She spoke something under her breath and then pointed at the radio, then at her pendant, then at the sky again. Evan nodded, starting to understand what she meant. Maybe the pendant was a device and she was trying to call someone. He brought her inside the cabin where it was warmer. She hesitated at the door, looking around like every object was strange and new to her. She seemed to study everything. The lamp, the old clock, the wooden walls. Her eyes widened when she saw the fire in the stove, as if she had never seen such a thing before. Evan smiled softly and motioned for her to sit near it. She sat down slowly, her silver tail curling close around her legs like a frightened animal. The radio on the table crackled faintly when he turned it on. The girl flinched at the sound, then leaned forward with deep concentration. Evan tried to fix the tuning, but the radio was old and half broken. Still, when he touched the pendant to one of the wires, the static grew louder, changing into a low hum. The girl's eyes brightened. She whispered something quickly, words flowing like a song. Then the sound faded again, leaving only the soft crackle of the old device. Her shoulders dropped. She looked down at the pendant sadly, as if she had failed. Evan placed a gentle hand near her, not touching, but close enough to show kindness. He told her not to worry, that they would figure it out. She could not understand the words, but she seemed to feel the tone. She looked up at him, her eyes shimmering faintly. For the first time, she did not look afraid. As the day went on, she helped him gather water from the stream. She was quiet, moving carefully, still limping. She seemed to study the trees, the birds, the sky above, almost like she was seeing Earth for the first time. When a squirrel ran across a branch, she gasped softly, watching it with childlike wonder. Evan found himself smiling more than he had in years. When they returned to the cabin, the girl sat by the window, staring at the forest. The light of the sunset reflected on her hair, turning it gold for a moment. She touched the glass with her fingers, tracing invisible shapes, stars, circles, lines. It was the same pattern she had drawn in the dirt the night before. He watched her for a while, thinking how fragile and lost she looked, yet there was something powerful behind those eyes, something beyond what he could imagine. As night came again, the rain returned softly. Evan brought her more food, but she only took a few bites before lying down near the stove. She wrapped herself in the blanket, her pendant still glowing faintly in her hand. Evan sat nearby, reading by the fire, though his eyes kept drifting toward her. He wondered what world she came from, how far it was, and who was looking for her now. Later, when he was almost asleep, he heard her whispering again. The same strange words, soft and slow like a prayer. He opened his eyes just enough to see her sitting up, holding the pendant toward the window. The faint blue light reflected against the glass. Her face was calm now, no longer afraid, and glowing faintly in her hands. Every few minutes she would whisper into it, her words soft like the hum of wind through glass. He could tell she was waiting for an answer, but none ever came. Evan tried to sleep, but the strange feeling in the air would not let him. He felt as if someone or something was watching from the darkness outside. The forest had a way of carrying sounds, but these sounds were different. There was a low vibration, like distant thunder, though the storm was already above them. He walked to the window and looked out. The trees moved wildly, the sky flashing with white light. Between those flashes, he thought he saw shadows moving. Not animal shapes, but tall and slow, almost human. He rubbed his eyes, thinking it might be his imagination. The girl noticed his unease. She stood beside him, her silver hair brushing against his arm. Her eyes reflected the light of the storm, and for a moment they glowed brighter than before. She pressed her small hand on the glass and the pendant pulsed in answer. Evan watched her and wondered if she felt danger too. She turned to him, her lips parting as if to speak, but no words came. Only a look, one of warning. A loud crash of thunder shook the cabin. Evan stepped back and the girl flinched, clutching the pendant tight. The fire flickered, and for a moment the room went dark except for the faint blue light from the pendant. In that light, her face looked pale and worried. Evan knelt down near her and spoke softly, telling her she was safe here. She didn't understand the words, but she seemed to feel the meaning. She nodded slowly and sat back down, curling up near the fire again. Hours passed like that, silence between them, broken only by the sound of rain and thunder. Then near midnight the pendant began to flicker again. Not softly, but in sharp bursts like it was alive. The girl gasped and held it close, whispering faster now. Evan leaned closer. The pendant made a faint sound, almost like static from a radio. He could hear something, a voice, distant and broken. It spoke in the same strange language she used, full of gentle tones and rising notes. The girl answered it quickly, tears filling her eyes. She nodded again and again, her voice shaking. Then the light stopped. The pendant went dark. The voice was gone. The girl froze, her expression falling from hope to heartbreak. She shook her head and whispered something that sounded like a plea. Evan didn't know what was said, but he knew what it meant. Whoever she had been talking to, whoever she was calling for him, had not come. The message had failed. She set the pendant down gently on the table, her hands trembling. Then she buried her face in her arms and cried softly. Her tears shimmered faintly like drops of starlight. Evan's chest tightened. He had seen many things in his life, but never someone so lost and alone. He walked closer and sat beside her. He didn't speak. He simply sat there, letting her cry. After a while, she looked up at him through wet eyes and gave a small nod, as if thanking him for staying. He picked up the pendant carefully and examined it. The device was broken. A thin crack ran along its side and small lines of light leaked out and then faded. He wondered if he could repair it, but it was unlike anything he had ever seen. Still, he decided to try. He fetched a few small tools and wires from his shelf and began to work. The girl watched him with silent hope. As he worked, she moved closer. She reached for one of the wires and connected it to the pendant herself. Her fingers steady despite her sadness. For a moment, the pendant flickered again, showing a weak pulse of blue. She smiled faintly through her tears. That tiny smile gave Evan strength. He worked late into the night, adjusting and testing even though he didn't fully understand the technology. It was enough that she believed he could help. By dawn, the storm had quieted and soft mist rolled through the trees. The pendant was glowing again, dim but steady. The girl held it to her chest, whispering a word, maybe a name. She looked at Evan with eyes full of gratitude. She pointed toward the sky, then to the pendant, and then to him. He understood. She was trying to say that when the signal reached her people, she wanted him to know it was because of him. Evan smiled faintly and nodded. He told her that he was glad she was safe even though she could not understand. She reached out and touched his hand briefly before pulling away. Her touch was warm and light, almost like static against his skin. Then she sat near the window again, holding the pendant and watching the sun rise through the mist. Evan poured himself some coffee and stood in silence, watching her. He thought about the strange light, the strange language, and the way she looked at the stars as if they were home. He realized he didn't care anymore about what she was or where she came from. What mattered was that she was alive, and that somehow in the middle of the endless forest, their paths had crossed. As the first rays of sunlight reached through the clouds, he saw her close her eyes, the pendant pulsing softly in her hands. She looked peaceful now, as if for the first time since he found her, she felt safe. Evan turned to the window, the forest glowing gold with the morning light. For the first time in years, he felt something he had long forgotten, the feeling that his life was meant for something more than solitude. The girl in his cabin was a mystery, but she had brought light into his quiet world, and deep inside he knew her arrival was only the beginning. The next few days passed in calm silence. The girl stayed in the cabin most of the time, watching Evan fix the pendant again and again, even though both knew it was almost beyond repair. She learned a few of his words, simple ones like food, fire, and safe. Each time she spoke them, her voice carried a soft music that made the small house feel alive. She was learning, slowly but surely, and she seemed to trust him more now. Every morning, Evan found her standing outside before sunrise, her silver hair glowing in the faint light. She always looked up at the sky as if waiting for something. He began to wonder if her people might be searching for her. Sometimes he caught her tracing symbols in the air with her glowing fingers, small shapes that shimmered for a few seconds before fading. One afternoon, while he was chopping wood, the girl suddenly ran out of the cabin. She pointed toward the horizon. A low hum filled the air, deep and strange, like metal vibrating far away. The sound grew louder until the bird stopped singing. She clutched the pendant against her chest and looked at him, her eyes wide with both hope and fear. Evan listened carefully. It wasn't thunder, not this time. It was steady, like an engine far above the clouds. Then he saw a brief flash of light move across the sky, fast and smooth like a falling star but moving in the wrong direction. The girl gasped and spoke her strange words quickly, the same ones she had whispered into the pendant before. Her whole body trembled. She seemed to be calling out, waiting for an answer. But then the sound stopped. The light faded. The sky returned to silence. The girl's shoulders dropped. She looked down, her hands shaking. Evan could see the pain in her face, that same sadness from the night she lost the signal. He walked to her and said softly that it might come back, that maybe it was too far for now. She didn't understand the words, but she looked into his eyes and seemed to hear the meaning. He decided to do something. That night after she fell asleep, he sat by the table with the pendant and his old radio again. He worked until his hands ached, connecting wires, twisting copper, trying to strengthen the signal. He had no idea how her technology worked, but he kept trying anyway. He wanted her to see hope again. When morning came, the girl woke to find him asleep at the table, his hands still resting near the pendant. She smiled faintly and covered him with the blanket. Then she stepped outside. The world was bright and quiet, the forest glittering with dew. She walked to the clearing where they had first met, her bare feet leaving faint glowing prints on the wet ground. She lifted the pendant toward the sun as if asking for help. A few moments later, Evan came outside. He saw her standing there, the light on her face, her tail moving slowly behind her. She looked like something from a dream, beautiful and not of this world. Then the pendant flickered again, this time stronger. A soft beam of light shot upward into the sky before fading. The girl gasped and looked back at him with tears in her eyes. She spoke one word he understood perfectly: home. But the forest around them did not stay quiet for long. As the day grew darker, strange things began to happen. The air felt heavy like a storm was coming, yet there were no clouds. The birds were gone again, and even the sound of wind seemed to vanish. Evan felt uneasy. He checked the woods around the cabin and noticed something that made his heart stop. Near the stream, the soft earth showed deep footprints, not human, not animal. They were too large, too heavy, and pressed deep into the mud. Something had been walking there, something looking for them. He returned to the cabin quickly. The girl sensed his worry and looked toward the door. Her ears twitched as she listened. Then she whispered one word in her language, a short, sharp sound that seemed to mean danger. She ran to the window, peering through the glass. In the distance, faint lights moved between the trees, white and green, silent but steady. Evan's breath caught. They were not lanterns. They moved too smooth, too deliberate. He turned off the lamp and motioned for her to stay quiet. They crouched near the floor as the lights drew closer. The faint hum returned, the same deep vibration from earlier, but now right outside the cabin. Through the cracks in the window, Evan saw 3 figures moving among the trees. They were tall, dressed in dark suits that shimmered under the strange light. Their faces were hidden behind smooth helmets. One of them carried a device that blinked with red symbols. The girl pressed her hands to her mouth, terrified. Evan looked at her and realized these were not her people. These were hunters. Whoever they were, they had come for her. The figures spread out around the clearing. One pointed toward the shed. Another raised a hand and spoke in a voice that sounded mechanical, flat and emotionless. The girl shook her head quickly, tears forming again. She whispered something to Evan, her voice trembling, and held up the pendant as if it could protect her. Evan knew he had to do something. He could not fight men with weapons, but he could protect her long enough to hide. He took her hand and led her toward the small door in the floor, the trap door leading to the old root cellar. She hesitated for a moment, fear and trust battling in her eyes, then nodded and crawled inside. Evan closed the door softly, covering it with a rug. Then he stood up, heart pounding as a knock echoed through the wooden walls. The voice outside called again, sharp and commanding. He stayed still, silent, every muscle tense. The lantern flickered once, then went out. Only the glow from the pendant below the floor shone faintly through the cracks. The men outside moved closer. One of them reached for the handle. Evan's breath caught in his throat. He knew if they found her, it would all be over. But he also knew he would not let that happen, not while he was still standing. The door rattled again, harder this time. Evan stood perfectly still, his hand resting against the old rifle hanging on the wall. He had not used it in years, but the weight of it gave him courage. Rain had started again outside, falling steady on the roof, mixing with the low hum of the strange machines in the forest. The knock came once more, and then a voice spoke, cold, metallic, and distant. It said something he couldn't understand, then repeated it louder. Evan stayed quiet. His heart beat so hard he could feel it in his throat. He could sense movement outside, shadows crossing past the windows, boots sinking into the wet ground. A soft light shone through the cracks in the wooden walls, moving slowly like a search beam. He heard a faint buzzing sound like an electric current, and then the doorknob turned. The latch held, but only barely. Below the floor, the girl stayed hidden in the cellar. She could hear everything. The voices, the rain, the footsteps. She pressed the pendant against her chest, its faint light glowing through her fingers. She closed her eyes and whispered softly, her voice shaking with fear. Evan looked at the rifle again. He didn't want to fight. He didn't even know who these people were, but the thought of them taking the girl made something burn in his chest. He had lost too much already. His family, his peace, his years of quiet, and now someone needed him. He could not turn away. The door burst open with a sharp crack. 3 figures stepped inside, water dripping from their black suits. Their helmets glowed faintly from within, hiding their faces completely. The first one raised a small round device that scanned the room with red light. The second spoke in that same mechanical tone, pointing toward the floor. Evan stood between them and the trapdoor, his voice steady though his hands trembled. He told them to leave, that there was no one here. They didn't respond. The first man raised a weapon, small but dangerous looking, the kind that hummed softly when charged. Evan took a step forward, blocking their path completely. He said again that they needed to leave. His voice echoed through the cabin, louder than he had meant it to. For a moment, everything went still. Rain poured outside. The fire crackled weakly in the corner, and then one of the strangers lowered his weapon and spoke into a device on his wrist. The sound that came back was full of static, but Evan heard one clear word: target. The man lifted the weapon again. Evan didn't think, he just reacted. He knocked the barrel aside and shoved the man backward. The shot missed, hitting the wall and sending a flash of blue light across the room. The smell of smoke filled the air. Evan swung the rifle, striking the second figure's arm. The man stumbled, but another one stepped forward, stronger, faster, raising his weapon directly at Evan's chest. Before he could fire, the floor beneath them glowed. A blinding flash of light shot upward from the cracks. The pendant. The girl's fear had turned into something powerful. The glow spread like a pulse through the entire cabin, shaking the walls. The strangers stumbled backward, shouting in their strange language. Their helmets flickered as their lights failed. Evan shielded his eyes from the brightness. The girl rose slowly from the floor, holding the pendant high. Her silver hair floated as if lifted by unseen wind, and her eyes shone like 2 stars. The light grew stronger, pushing the intruders back toward the door. They tried to fight against it, but the glow spread faster, surrounding them in blue fire. Then, without warning, the light burst outward in a single wave. When the flash faded, the room was silent again. The strangers were gone. The door hung open, swinging gently in the rain. Only the smell of burned air and the faint hum of the pendant remained. Evan dropped the rifle and rushed to the girl. She was on the floor, breathing weakly, the pendant still glowing faintly in her hand. He knelt beside her, calling her name, though he didn't know it. She opened her eyes slightly, her voice soft and tired. She whispered a few words, slow and broken, then touched his hand. Her fingers were cold, but her eyes were calm, full of trust. He lifted her gently and carried her to the bed. She was light, fragile, almost weightless. He covered her with a blanket and stayed beside her through the night. Rain continued to fall outside, washing away the strange footprints from the clearing. Hours passed before she stirred again. When she did, she looked at him and tried to smile. The pendant's glow dimmed until it was only a small spark. She said one word he understood, "Safe." He nodded and smiled back, though his heart was heavy. He didn't know what had happened to the men or where they had gone, but he knew they would not come back soon. The girl rested quietly, her breathing slow. Evan sat beside her until dawn. He thought about everything that had happened, the lights, the strange men, the power she had released. None of it made sense, but he didn't care anymore. He only cared that she was alive. As morning light filled the cabin, he looked out through the window. The forest seemed peaceful again, the fog soft and white. But deep inside, he knew something had changed. The pendant had saved them, but it had also called attention. Somewhere out there, someone must have seen the light. Someone would come again. He turned back to the girl, still asleep, and whispered quietly that he would protect her, no matter what came next. She could not hear him, but she smiled faintly in her sleep as if she understood. Outside, the rain stopped and a thin ray of sunlight touched the roof of the cabin. For the first time since that night when he found her, Evan allowed himself to hope. But in that same hope, a question lingered in his heart. How long could peace last when the sky itself was looking for her? Morning came quietly after a long and restless night. The forest was still wet from the rain, and mist drifted between the trees like soft white smoke. Evan stepped outside, his boots sinking into the damp soil. The air smelled fresh, but something in it felt heavy, as if the forest was holding its breath. He looked around for any sign of the strange men, but the clearing was empty. Only broken branches and faint burn marks on the ground remained, the last traces of the night before. When he went back inside, the girl was awake. She sat near the window, wrapped in the blanket, her silver hair falling over her shoulders. Her face looked pale and tired, but her eyes were calm. The pendant rested on the table beside her, its light faint like a dying ember. She turned toward him and smiled softly, the kind of smile that said more than words could. Evan brought her some food, but she shook her head. Instead, she pointed at the pendant, then at the sky. He could tell she wanted to fix it again. It was her only way home. He sat beside her and looked at the small device. It was cracked along the side, its glow flickering like a candle in the wind. He had already tried every tool he had, but maybe with her help it could work again. She watched him carefully as he worked. Sometimes she would guide his hand, showing which wire to touch, which piece to turn. Her fingers moved gracefully even when she was weak. He realized she understood the machine like someone who had built it herself. After a while, the pendant began to hum softly again. A tiny spark lit up at the center, glowing brighter each second. The girl's eyes widened with hope. She pressed the pendant to her chest and whispered something, a word that sounded like a prayer. Then for a moment, a soft beam of light shot upward, vanishing through the roof and into the sky. Evan stared in awe. The beam lasted only a few seconds, then disappeared, leaving silence behind. The pendant dimmed once more, but the girl's expression stayed hopeful. He asked her quietly if she thought they would come for her now. She didn't understand his words, but she nodded as if she did. She reached out and took his hand, pressing it gently against her chest where the pendant rested. Her heartbeat was soft but strong. Then she looked up, her eyes full of something he couldn't quite name. Gratitude, sadness, maybe both. For the next few days, they waited. The weather cleared and the forest grew bright again. The girl spent her morning sitting outside near the stream, her tail curling lazily behind her as she hummed quiet tunes. Evan watched her from the cabin, feeling something deep in his chest he hadn't felt in years, a mix of peace and worry. At night, she would sit by the fire, tracing stars in the air with her glowing fingers. Sometimes she pointed to one in particular, a bright one in the northern sky, and whispered a name. Evan guessed that was her home. He would listen, even though he didn't understand. It didn't matter. He liked the sound of her voice, soft, calm, full of wonder. One evening, as the sun began to set, she handed him a small wooden carving. He recognized it as the pendant's shape, carefully made from one of the logs near the fire. She had been carving it in secret. She placed it in his hand and said one clear word in English, "Promise." Her voice trembled, but her eyes were steady. Evan felt his throat tighten. He didn't know what to say, so he just nodded. "I promise," he said softly. That night, a strange feeling filled the air again. The same deep vibration he had heard before, distant but steady. He went outside and the girl followed him to the clearing. The sky above them shimmered faintly with pale light, like something stirring beyond the clouds. The girl looked up, her face glowing with tears. She whispered her strange language again, faster now, her words rising like a song. The pendant in her hands began to glow brighter than ever before. The sound grew louder, a low hum turning into a deep echo that shook the trees. The wind swirled around them and the sky split open with a flash of silver light. Evan shielded his eyes, but she stood still, arms lifted, her pendant pulsing with light that matched the glow in the heavens. Then the light faded just as suddenly as it came. The forest fell silent again. The girl turned to him slowly, her face calm but sad. She touched his chest where her wooden carving now hung from a string he had made. She said his name for the first time, not perfectly but softly. Evan. He felt his heart stop for a moment. She smiled faintly, her eyes glistening. She pointed at the sky again and whispered, "Soon." He nodded, not trusting his voice. He understood now. Her people had heard her call. They would come, and when they did, she would leave. The thought hurt more than he expected. That night he stayed awake while she slept. The pendant glowed faintly beside her like a small heartbeat of light. He watched her breathing slowly, peacefully, and realized how much she had changed his life in such a short time. Before she came, the cabin had been just wood and silence. Now it felt alive, full of warmth, hope, and something like love, though he never dared to name it. Outside, the forest was quiet again, but the stars seemed brighter than before. Evan looked out the window, clutching the small wooden carving she had given him. He whispered her word, "Promise," and looked toward the sky where she always stared. Something told him that the next night would not be the same. The sky felt heavier, the air charged with energy. Her people were close now, and though a part of him wanted to hold on, he knew he couldn't. She did not belong to the forest or the earth. She belonged to the stars. The last night came quietly with no rain and no wind, only the sound of the forest breathing. The sky was clear, filled with more stars than Evan had ever seen before. He stood outside the cabin for a long time, staring up at the endless dark sky. Something inside him told him this would be the night everything changed. Inside, the girl was awake. She sat by the window, her silver hair shining in the soft light from the fire. The pendant lay in her hand, glowing brighter than it had in days. It pulsed with slow, steady light, almost like it had a heartbeat of its own. When she saw him standing by the door, she smiled gently. It was not the smile of someone who had found peace. It was the kind of smile that said goodbye without using words. Evan came closer and sat across from her. For a moment, neither spoke. He didn't know what to say, and even if he did, he doubted she would understand. But somehow silence was enough. The fire crackled softly, the light flickering between them. After a long moment, she stood and motioned for him to follow her outside. He hesitated, but then did as she asked. The forest was quiet, glowing faintly under the moonlight. She walked barefoot through the grass toward the clearing where they had first met. The air felt strange, heavy and electric, like the sky itself was waiting. When they reached the center of the clearing, the girl turned to him and placed the pendant in his hand. It was warm and humming softly. She closed his fingers around it and whispered one word, "Together." Then she stepped back and lifted her face to the stars. A moment later, the light began. It started as a soft glow from the pendant, then grew into a beam that stretched upward through the night sky. The air vibrated and a deep hum filled the forest, the same sound Evan had heard before but stronger now. The ground shook under his feet and the trees around them began to sway. The girl stood in the middle of it all, her hair floating in the strange wind, her eyes glowing brighter than ever. Evan wanted to move toward her, to pull her back, but he couldn't. The light surrounded her like a shield, soft and pure, wrapping her in a silver glow. He could only watch. Then he saw it. Far above, a shape appeared among the stars. It moved silently, shining with the same blue light as her pendant. It grew larger as it descended, not falling but gliding smoothly until it hovered above the clearing. It was a ship, silent and beautiful, like a piece of the night sky come alive. The girl turned to him one last time. Tears shone in her eyes, but her face was calm. She walked closer, stopping just a step away. She reached out and touched his cheek, her hand trembling. "Thank you," she whispered in soft, careful English. The words were simple, but they carried every feeling she could not say. Evan's throat tightened. He wanted to speak, to tell her she didn't have to go, but he couldn't form the words. He simply nodded, holding her gaze. Her eyes shimmered like liquid silver. She smiled again, small and sad, then stepped back into the circle of light. The beam from the pendant lifted her slowly into the air. Her feet left the ground and her body rose gently toward the ship above. Evan watched, frozen in place, as she ascended through the glow. Her hair floated around her like a halo, and for a moment she looked more like light than flesh. The forest was silent except for the soft hum of the ship. When she reached the beam's center, she turned her head one last time. Their eyes met, and she pressed her hands together in front of her heart, the same motion she had made the night he found her. Then, like a whisper, she was gone. The light faded. The hum stopped. The clearing was empty again. The pendant fell from the air and landed softly at his feet, its light completely gone. Evan bent down and picked it up. It was cold now, just a small piece of metal and glass, but it felt heavier than before, heavy with memory. He stood there for a long time, staring at the spot where she had been. The stars above were still bright, but the sky felt different now, emptier. He walked back to the cabin in silence. Everything looked the same. The fire still burning, the chair still by the window. Yet everything felt changed. The place that once felt lonely now felt sacred, touched by something beyond his understanding. He set the pendant on the table and sat down beside it. As dawn began to rise, he looked out the window one last time. The forest was calm again, and a gentle fog hung over the trees. He thought of her voice, her laughter, the way she had stared at the stars. He thought of her word, promise. He whispered it softly to himself and smiled. He knew she was gone, but somehow he didn't feel alone anymore. She had come into his life like a storm and left like a sunrise, leaving behind something bright inside him. He looked at the pendant still resting quietly on the table, and then at the sky where she had vanished. Somewhere out there, he believed she was looking back, remembering the man who had given her shelter in a lonely cabin deep in the woods. He hoped she was safe, home among the stars where she belonged. Evan stood at the door and took a deep breath of the morning air. The wind carried the scent of pine and fresh earth. He whispered her name, the one she had told him the night before she left, soft and short like music. The sound disappeared into the forest,